Greetings to one and all, this is Armoured and today we have Col Manoj Channan here with us, and today, that is 29th of July, serves as a very significant day. Let's hear it from him. Why does this day plays a significant role in his life? So first of all, thank you very much, sir, for your time and the contributions you have been making. Can you please tell our viewers that what is so significant on 29th of July?
Good evening, Vaibhav. Thank you for having me with you, and good evening to all the viewers. I think 29th July this year has a very significant meaning for all of us as veterans of Pawan, because this was the day when the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was signed between late Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and late President Julius Jayawardene of Sri Lanka. This accord had many ramifications for the fact that when it was signed and the Prime Minister had landed up in Sri Lanka to sign the accord, he was butted by a naval ensign, which, if you remember, was caught on TV, which many sort of overlooked, but it had a communication which we missed, that the accord did not go well with the rank and file of the defense services and maybe the citizens of Sri Lanka. At the same time, the head of the LTTE, late Prabhakaran, was also not on board, and he had sort of been shoehorned into agreeing that he needs to be on board for bonhomie of the relationship within us and Sri Lanka and for the betterment of the northeastern provinces. So today is the 35th anniversary, and this morning we had all gathered at the National War Memorial. This was the second occasion when we went and laid down the wreath. It was led, of course, by the mother of a young second lieutenant from the sappers, a Veer Chakra, and as a nation we hardly remember our brave hearts, but we as veterans felt that she would be the right person or the guest of honor to do this. This morning she was escorted by Lieutenant General Milan Naidu, whom you would remember was the erstwhile Vice Chief of Army Staff. He was commanding 5 Rajput at Trincomalee in Operation Pawan. And we were there about more than 50 couples or maybe 100 people as ladies and officers who had gathered to remember our brave hearts. So the ceremony was that the wreath was laid at the central well of the National War Memorial, and thereafter, as you're aware, all the brave hearts who have been killed in action, their names are etched on each brick. So unit-wise, we all went and played our floral tributes to each one of them. So it is a day of remembrance, and it's also a day of gratitude to remember the brave hearts who we often don't remember in the last 35 years.
And sir, that we are speaking about Operation Pawan today. So Op Pawan has been documented several times in different domains, focusing on different aspects, but it is always fascinating to know that what exactly happened and what were the contributions you made as serving as a captain in Sri Lanka.
Firstly, let me just correct you. Op Pawan has not been documented officially, other than what were the reports and returns that were filed by the units and the formation headquarters that time to the army headquarters. Now that is something which has not been declassified as on date. What has been recorded in public domain are personal experiences of people, units, commanding officers, individuals, based on their remembrances and their experiences.
Okay.
In the recent past, some of us as veterans of Operation Pawan, we got together and we sort of wrote out individual experiences, and this was published in a book called Valiant Deeds and Undying Memories, published by Lieutenant Colonel Atul Kochar and Colonel Ravi Nair. Colonel Kochar is from 1 Jekalai. He was a young second lieutenant. Colonel Nair that time was a major and he was serving with the Armoured Corps. He was responsible for setting up the first interrogation center at Jaffna. And this book is not about I, me and myself. It is about what people did to bring out the valiant deeds of individuals which surely do not get eclipsed under the various narratives of Vijay or of the stories that you hear of 1971 or 65. Unfortunately, these stories have not been told, and since they have not been told, they do not get the importance that they deserve. Just to bring it on record, in Operation Vijay, we had about 527 officers and men killed. In Pawan, which was an operation of over about 2.5 years, vis-a-vis 2.5 months. Operation Vijay was in India, it was on our territory. Operation Pawan was going across into an unknown country, no maps, no intelligence, and a very dynamic, changing political operational scenario. To further expand on it, I would have to step back a bit to say that sometime around 5th of June 1987, when the Sri Lankan army had launched a major offensive against the LTTE, the government of India had stepped in to provide an aid, in which I think they launched about 19 odd ships with rations and medical care to provide to the Tamils of the northern and eastern provinces. As these boats approached the Sri Lankan waters, they were contested by the Sri Lankan Coast Guard. We had probably an MEA official on board who sort of addressed the Sri Lankan Coast Guard to tell them that, listen, we are here not to fight with you, but we are here to help the people of northern and eastern provinces who are without the basics of food, water and medicine.
Right.
The Indian government had anticipated that this move will be contested. So we had also launched 5 AN-32s, which were escorted by Mirage 2000s. They were the recent acquisitions those days. The Sri Lankan Air Force had nothing which could match the firepower of the Mirages. And so these 4 aircrafts were launched into Jaffna, and under the cover of the Mirages, they airdropped food relief and medication to these people. This happened on 5th of June. By then, sort of people knew that the intent of this Indian government was to support the LTTE and the Tamils, and therefore Julius Jayawardene was pretty smart as a politician. So he, I think, sort of offered that why don't we sign a peace accord where the Indian government should take on the responsibility to ensure that the peace is maintained in north and east, the LTT militant groups are disarmed, and he would go through the process of going through an election and installing a chief minister and giving the autonomous region to these places. While this may be very true to the recent memory of the folks around, but let me take you back to 1983, when the situation was fermenting earlier. Jayawardene was still the president. The situation was equally bad, and there was a discussion that we need to intervene. So somewhere post 1971, when the Indian Army had moved into Bangladesh or the erstwhile East Pakistan, it had effectively used the Mukti Bahini to support its operations and achieve the end results that it wanted to do by liberating the country of East Pakistan and handing it over to the local population. So if you remember those days, everybody likes to sign off on a good accord, and maybe the chiefs and the political leadership felt that 83 was a good time to do that. But I think Julius J. Vertne was a wily fox, and he understood that what's going to happen. So he sort of cooled down and did not move as aggressively as he did in 1987. So that time the Indian Army did not do anything, and some of the units which had been tasked were told to sort of stand down and keep it very quiet. Now when this was happening, now let's go back to June 87, and a little before June 87, let's move back to year 1986. We had General Sundarji as the Chief of Army Staff. We had a young Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi. We had a coterie of friends who sort of told them that the Indian nation was now all set to be a regional power, and therefore it needed to project itself accordingly. And as you would remember, General Sundarji would be called by magazines like the Time magazine from the US that he was a general fit enough to be commanding a NATO force. And such statements, give a lot of hype to a self-esteem of a general, and he felt that yes, now is the time that India should flex its muscles. Indian Army had been modernized, the Indian Air Force had been modernized, the Navy was pretty well organized itself. So they conducted a series of exercises called the Brass Tacks, series 1 to 4. During that period, if you remember, there was Sum Dongchu incident which happened in Arunachal Pradesh, where the Chinese thought they would like to flex their muscles. We had our erstwhile chief, General V.N. Sharma, known as Tich Sharma, who was commanding the Eastern Army. He put his foot down and made sure that the Chinese couldn't move. And while stalling the Chinese on that side, we in October 86, it was a mobilization, literally the mobilization of the army for a major exercise. As a veteran, I still don't know whether we actually mobilized for an exercise or were we actually going for a conflict with Pakistan to resolve all issues. We were there in the deserts, all the strike corps had been launched. We had new T-72 tanks. The Air Force was well equipped with new Jaguars and new Mirages. The Navy was also, pretty aggressive in its own way. And then General Ziaul Haq decided to fly into Jaipur for a one-day cricket match between India and Pakistan, and he met our Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. Now what I'm going to narrate right now is all hearsay, so there's no authentic report that I have, but apparently Zia told Rajiv Gandhi that I suggest you move your troops back, otherwise I'll nuke you. Now this is a statement which reportedly Zia made, but we still don't know whether it's a fact or not, but it remains that we did not attack Pakistan, and we conducted an exercise which was north to south in the deserts and north east to west. So I think that conveys a lot, and it also brings out a very important point that we were trained for conventional ops and we were looking at conventional operations against the Pakis. Wrong to call them Pakis on a public media, but Pakistanis. Now, having pulled back from Brass Tacks in April 1987, we had hardly got back to our bases in central India when we were suddenly mobilized again to say that we have to be prepared to go into operations in Sri Lanka for offensive operations. And we were on a standby time limit of about initially 6 hours, reduced to 2 hours, and this continued for days and days till the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was signed. But in the meanwhile, as an armoured regiment, we sent a squadron up to be further deployed southwards so that if required they could quickly be mobilized and sent into the island. The options of how to get them into the island were open. They could move by ship, they could move by the IL-76 aircrafts that we had, and we had done some training on that prior to that. So once the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord got signed on 29th, on 30th of July 1987, first troops of the peacekeeping force from 8 Mahar a PVC battalion. It got its PVC later in the month of November, I think, 87. They landed there. They had apprehensions as troops who had been told that they're going to be heli-lifted into Sri Lanka for an offensive attack. And at midnight or past midnight, they were told, instead of helicopters, now you're going in an AN-32 for a role which was for peacekeeping. It is no more an offensive operation. So you can imagine the stress levels within the officers and the troops when they're going to go into an effective operation, and suddenly the orders being changed at midnight or past midnight to say that you no more are going into an offensive operation, but now you're going in for peacekeeping. You have no lay of the land, you have no intelligence, and you're flying in an aircraft, and when you're circling overhead, you see below you Sri Lankan troops, and they're all armed and they have their vehicles and everything around, and you are not aware as you have to fight them or you have to just land and walk in. So the troops were told by Colonel Vad, I'm sure you'll get an opportunity to speak to him also. He told, as a company commander, he told the guys in the aircraft that please load your weapons and be ready to fight it out.
Okay.
You don't know what's going to happen. So when they landed, they got to the end of the runway. The hatch was open, the troops got out, they went and hit the ground and sort of took positions. And the aircraft closed the hatch and it took off. Now the guys were on ground, they were self-contained for 72 hours for food, which means basically shakkar paras and pani. And they were looking at the Sri Lankan and they didn't know what reaction to come. But fortunately things didn't work out in the negative manner. These Sri Lankans approached them and they said, fine, welcome, we understand peace accord has to be signed and so on and so forth. So they could go and deploy, and so that was the entry to Sri Lanka on 30th of July 1987. Thereafter the troops were, as more troops were ferried in. Some troops went into Trincomalee by ship, some people were flown into Jaffna, but the task now was of peacekeeping. So peacekeeping meant that you only had your personal weapon but did not carry it out at all times, because your aim was not to fight, it was to ensure that peace and tranquility was maintained all around. So you were in a peace mode. So you have to understand that basic aspect. So there was a lot of bonhomie between the peacekeeping troops and officers with the LTTE and the other militant groups and the local population, and the local population received them with a lot of floral tributes and welcome ceremonies and interactions. For some reason, the troops who had been sent into Jaffna were not allowed to go beyond a certain point. That you will restrict yourself to these areas, and whatever has to be done with the militant groups, we'll talk to them, we'll tell them to disarm and so on and so forth. So that activity also took place. The friendly Tamil groups sort of put down their weapons. LTTE was smart, they gave us something but maintained and kept most of the weapons away.
Okay.
As days went by and the bonhomie kept increasing, but there was a reason for the LTTE to be pretty upset. As I told you, when the peace accord was signed, Prabhakaran was not on board. And when Prabhakaran was not on board, the late Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and his staff probably of research and analysis wing told Prabhakaran that since you're not on board with us on the signing of the accord, we carry two hoods, you please carry on. He had been flown in from Sri Lanka to Chennai and Chennai to Delhi. Now he is told in Delhi that you will not be, you find your way back home. Okay. We don't know. So that was something which was taken as a personal umbrage by Prabhakaran, and he said, I'm not going to take it lying down. And you know what happened on 21st of May 1991 when Rajiv Gandhi was killed by a suicide attack. So this was just to give you a background as to what happened in the past and what would ramifications be happening much later in 91. So during 87, now this thing was boiling within the leadership of the LTTE that they had been compromised by the Indian government. And though we had no lien on them, they were not our citizens, they were not our terrorist group, they were not our freedom fighters, they were of the Sri Lankans. But it was incorrect for us to assume that we would engage with them, guide them, or order them, which as a normal course of thing, even if I were to start ordering you around, you'd not like it.
Right.
You know, who the hell are you? I mean, you would probably give me that answer. So that was something that was happening between LTTE and the IPKF. In the meantime, since LTTE was continuing to do what it had to do, it was some of the cadres were picked up, known as the Sea Tigers, by the Sri Lankan Navy. This was towards the end of September, early October, and they were apprehended and brought to the Palali airfield. They were held there because it was our charter to make sure that nothing happened to the LTTE. So our unit of 10 para commandos, which was co-located there, sort of surrounded that aircraft to say that we will not allow you to transport these cadres back to Colombo, because that would made a great divide between us and the LTTE. So now we had an aircraft with Sri Lankan troops around it, and we had an outer perimeter of 10 special forces covering that.
Okay.
And now there was a flurry of activity on the hotline between Jaffna and Colombo, Jaffna and Southern Command Headquarters, the Southern Army Commander with GOC IPKF General Kalkat, and all the way to Delhi, Army Headquarters, and the Army Headquarters, and that is General Sundarji's office, and the Prime Minister's office was now controlling the entire issue. So in between, nobody was a decision maker. So you can understand the confusion and the kind of pressures that were all around. So these 17 fellows who were now captured suddenly went on a hunger strike. They said, we will not eat any food, we will fast on to death. So we said, okay, we can't allow you to die. So we said, we'll supply you food. And we told the LTT cadres who were friendly to us that kindly supply them the food. They said, why not? So 17 packages were given. And since the Sri Lankans, they would typically ensure that when an LTT cadre was caught, they would remove his cyanide capsule.
Okay.
Because each LTT cadre would actually wear a cyanide capsule, because in fear of capture, he would actually bite it and commit a suicide. So these guys sent in 17 cyanide capsules to these 17 captives.
Okay.
So these guys, when they removed the food particles, they bit that capsule and they committed suicide. Now, that's when all hell broke loose. The LTT was aware what they had done. Indian Army, IPKF, in good faith, never checked the food that was going in. And the ramification was that these people killed themselves. So the moment that happened, LTTE announced that it was no more part of the Sri Lanka Peace Accord, and there was an active combat that commenced on 10th of October 1987. And that is the day when the IPKF, which was an Indian peacekeeping force, suddenly became a peace enforcement force, where it got into a combat with the people who they were supposed to disarm and be friendly with.
Now it was an offensive operation.
Yes. So even in an article which I wrote and which got published this morning, I've written a word. The friends of today suddenly became enemies of our tomorrow. And it happened in a fraction of a minute. Now you can imagine that you're in a peacekeeping mode, you're not carrying your weapons, your ammunition is in a different way, to ensure that safety and security.
Right.
Your heavy support weapons of the units are somewhere else. So in the first 72 hours there was commotion. And an army which was not trained for conventional operations was suddenly put into a engagement which was in fighting in built-up areas and in jungle warfare. So now you are fighting an enemy whom you have trained yourself, and you taught them everything as to how to negate a conventional army. And the same people whom you had taught were sent by the LTTE to fight with the Palestinians in Lebanon and Beirut, resulting in they refining their skills far better after fighting these Israelis. And they had also, in their preparations, blackened out all the signages in the English language and ensured that we had no clue as to where we are. We did not know where the lay of the land was. We had no maps, and we, as I told you earlier, were not even going beyond a certain limit.
Completely clueless. Right.
And here now we were launched into operations, and suddenly you move 100, 200 meters and you are engaged by the LTTE. So we took casualties. We were hurt. We had many killed. We had many injured. But the Indian soldier and the Indian military leadership has been such that it has always risen to the occasion, and we learnt overnight as to how to contest this, and we had to sort of engage with them in a proactive manner. And in the first 72 hours, of course, there was chaos, but slowly people realized that how to engage with them and what was the tactics that the LTT was employing, and therefore we could overcome it and get them, get back at them. So, having explained to you as to how the Indian Army and IPKF changed over from its peacekeeping role to a peace enforcement, we had a maverick Brigadier Manjeet Singh who came in as commander of 41 Infantry Brigade, and he actually got the bull by the horns and led the infantry battalions right from the front, ensured that commanding officers also moved as per his bidding, not to get cowed down by the casualties that we suffered. While all this was happening, it's very important to also bring out a facet that night 11th, 12th October, the GOC IPKF and General Harkirat as GOC 54 Dev, Infantry Dev, realized that maybe the LTT command and control structure was located at the Jaffna University.
Okay.
And therefore, if Jaffna University was attacked and the leadership eliminated there, it would actually speeden up the operations of clearing out the LTT from the Jaffna Peninsula. Unfortunately, that was a badly planned operation. There was very little information available in terms of intelligence. Units 13th Sikhalai had just been landed into the island and into Jaffna. They had no idea of what was happening within the environment and what odds they were fighting against. But David Quarters had engaged or employed 10 special forces, thinking that these para-commandos would be, effective in negating this threat along with conventional infantry. So operations were launched by using Air Force helicopters, Mi-8s, and the troops were to be landed into Jaffna University. And unfortunately, bad planned ops. LTT was monitoring all the radio communication. They were aware of the operation to be carried out. So when these troops were slithering down, they were caught under devastating automatic weapon fire. Not getting into the nitty-gritties of what happened, but we all know, as history has recorded, 13th Sikhalai lost a platoon, one officer, one JSU, and I think 28, 29 other ranks, if I remember correctly. 10 special forces also suffered casualties, but they being highly trained, they sort of melted into the environment around the sounds, and the officer of 13th Sikhalai who was there, his radio set had got shot up, so he was not in communication with anybody. 10SF, I'm told later on, advised the officer that please, you need to vacate and not fight here because operations are compromised. But he was anticipating the rest of his battalion coming in.
Okay.
And he didn't want his comrades or buddies to now be caught in this killing zone. So he thought that he'll fight for the last man, last bullet, and he did that as a gallant officer of the Indian Army, knowing fully well that he's not going to survive. So that was one action which was very, very gallant, because the troops, the officers did what they had to. We'll not get into the decision-making process of this operation. That's beyond my charter. And I really have no idea as to why it was planned, other than the fact that they felt that if they eliminated the LTTE, the operations would have been speeded up. But going by conventional military logic, it was a bad planned operation because you had no intelligence. Post that, as I mentioned earlier, that General Brigadier Manjeet had launched the operations on 2-3 axis towards Jaffna town. We'll have more people come and speak to you on that, and they'll give you more details as to how each of those thrust lines moved and what was involved in fighting those individual battles over a period of 15 days that they reached Jaffna fort. The LTT by then realized that it could not match the conventional military power of the Indian Army, and therefore it withdrew into the jungles. And in conventional military operations, even withdrawal, some people think is a bad thing to do, but no, withdrawal is always to survive and fight another day. So the LTT moved out from Jaffna and it melted into the jungles of Bavania, Mulai Tibu on the northeastern, or rather, northwestern coast of Sri Lanka. And they sort of consolidated themselves there. By then, Indian Army also realized that it now had to contain and take the fight where it was. So initially, when the induction took place in 87, we had 54 Infantry Div in Jaffna, we had 36 Infantry Division in Trincomalee. So the thought process was that the initial battles would be fought in Jaffna, and maybe the battle will shift to Trincomalee, and therefore 36 was already poised to take on the battle if troops or the LTT came that way. But instead of coming that way, they moved in the opposite direction. So 4 Infantry Div was inducted in, and along with that 57 Mountain Div was also inducted in. 4 Infantry Div went straight into Bhavania, 57 came into Trincomalee and went further south into Batiklova. The mech element of the IPKF was 65 Armoured Regiment, that is my unit, and we had 13 Mechanized Infantry Battalion, and we also had 15 Mechanized Infantry Battalion with us.
Okay.
We had a small complement of 17 Mechanized Infantry, one of the companies. It's a Reckitt Sport Battalion which had been inducted in. These guys were flown in straight from Jaisalmer into Batiklova, so you can imagine from the deserts straight into jungle, and so they really didn't know what hit them, but we're fortunate that they did not get into an active engagement on landing. So the combat command of the Armoured Regiment and the Mechanized Battalions was restructured. So we had 65 Armoured Regiment with a company of 15 mech and not 15 mech but a company of 13 mech move into Batiklova along with 57 Div to make sure that there is an offensive capability with the infantry division that side. 13 mech with a squadron of 65 was maintained at Trincomalee. Trincomalee is the harbour, which is a deep draft harbour where large ships come and literally come to the port, so they don't have to be at sea, and then transshipment has to take place through barges. And 54 Div continued to be at Jaffna, 4 infantry div was inducted into Bhavania.
Okay.
And we gave Alpha Squadron, one of our squadrons, to go and deploy with them under 15 meg.
Okay.
So the combat group deployment was at 15, combat group 15 with a squadron of 65 was at Bhavania. Combat group 13 with a squadron of 65 was at Trincomalee, and combat group 65 was at Patiklova. Most people think as to what was the reason that Armoured Corps had been inducted in, or the mechanized forces. We were there to ensure the will of the GOC IPKF on the Sri Lankan forces. Ours was not a conventional battle to fight against the LTTE, because mechanized troops are used more for offensive operations,
right,
and not for fighting CI ops. But while we were there, we also put our tanks and equipment into a garage formation, and we also did all the tasks that each of the infantry battalions was doing. And we had been given our area of responsibility, but not as large as the infantry units. We have a restriction because the equipment has to be looked after and maintained. We are only a 3-man crew. So somebody has to be on the tank, somebody has to do the guard duty, and somebody has to go and do the patrolling and other operations. So that was the configuration that we got into sometime in by March 1988. Thereafter, we actively got involved into preparing or assisting the local administration and opening up the roads, clearing them of all the IDs, the railway tracks, ensuring that civil administration got back to full functional ability, that your telephones were made functional, your post office was made functional, your healthcare, and we were assisting the Sri Lankans in every possible manner to make sure that their civil administration is fully functional. And we also assisted them in having their elections. So as anybody would say that, the army was there and the Indian army made sure that so and so on. We were not there to mark ballots for any party. We were there just to give them local security, to the Sinhala polling officials, that they would not be fired upon against by the LTTE, and to ensure that the polling booths are kept free. No Tamil groups sort of could influence the polling pattern. So we had no role to play other than that, and of course we suffered casualties. IPKF suffered casualties, not the locals. So successful elections were conducted, and we had the civil administration gear up and move on, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, presidential elections took place in Sri Lanka. Julius Jayawardene lost it, and we had President Premadasa come in. So before, let's go back to 87 for a moment, because I want to bring out a very important aspect. When IPK moved into Sri Lanka, it released the Sri Lankan armed forces to go and deploy the forces in southern Sri Lanka to fight the JVP.
Okay.
That was the Sinhala insurgent group that was again fighting against the Sri Lankan government. So we took a lot of pressure off the Sri Lankan government from taking off their commitments towards deploying troops against the Tamil groups. Now they had to fight their own in-house insurgency. Okay.
So it was very strategically divided.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was in our interest to ensure that Sri Lanka remains united, and so it's not sort of torn apart between the various insurgencies. But so coming back to when Premadasa came into the chair, by then insurgencies were under some relative control on both sides by the Sri Lankan army and the IPKF. Premadasa felt that IPKF was not wanted on the Sri Lankan soil.
Okay.
So I will quote an incident from GOC IPKF General Kalkat, which he sort of narrated to us in a one-on-one interaction last year, around on the same date, that the chief of the Sri Lankan army, who had done staff college with him, landed up in Trincomalee to meet with him.
Okay.
And he was carrying a letter signed by the President of Sri Lanka that please withdraw your forces from the island.
So IPKF was officially asked to move?
No, it was not.
Okay.
He had just flown in and he was to meet him.
Okay.
So when he landed at Trincomalee, GOC IPKF met him on the tarmac And the Sri Lankan chief told him, he says, why don't you, sir, come along and let's take a walk. So they walked on the tarmac and they had nobody around then. So the Sri Lankan army chief tells him, he says, sir, I'm carrying a letter. My president wants you to vacate and go away. So GOC IPKF told him, he says, listen, I'm the GOC of the IPKF. I take my orders from the Indian government, not from your chief president. I suggest you take this letter back because I'll not take it. And you know me, he says, we've done staff course together. I'm here and I'm here to achieve my government's aims. So please don't do anything which will make me take an action contrary to what you are thinking. And other than that, I don't know what else was discussed, but this is a gist of the conversation that he shared with us. But since I was part of the Armoured Regiment, and we were very candidly told that please now do reconnaissance of all the Sri Lankan establishments, and we prepared to, if required, move towards Colombo. So, as good officers, we went and did a recce. The Sri Lankans realized that there was something amiss because they knew that the armor guys will not start doing reconnaissance unless there's a reason. So they told us very candidly, sir, we know what's wrong. These are our phone numbers, local numbers. Give us a call, we'll surrender. But don't kill us. We said, no, we're not here. But since you wanted to give us your number, we'll note it down. There's a problem. And so have a cup of tea and see what they were deployed and so on and so forth and come back. But in the meantime, as you're aware, the environment changed within India also. Rajiv Gandhi had been voted out. We had VP Singh come in. And suddenly the political dynamics changed. Within the south, there was a lot of angst against the IPKF because people were not happy that we were fighting the LTTE. So all the heroic worship that was happening in 1987 now had changed. And people were now, anybody they would see, from the Army, Air Force, Navy, going towards Sri Lanka, they would have a lot of anger and sort of, they would be against your, they would not sort of look at you very welcomingly and they would sort of oppose you this thing. So we wouldn't give a damn about it because our task was not in our country, it was that side. So when all this happened, Indian government took a decision that it will start de-induction. So the de-induction actually started sometime in September to December of 1988. And 1989. And 24 Mountain Brigade, which was the southernmost brigade deployed in 57, they were pulled out. They came to Batticaloa, from Batticaloa to Trincomalee and so on, So you do a leapfrogging backwards so that, you're not caught. And slowly and steadily we withdrew from the island and de-inducted by end April 1990. On de-induction, because of the political rivalries and other issues, there was no reception, everything kept quiet. The units came, the units were sent back. And the same units which had now been fighting in Sri Lanka during the period of 1987 to 1989, there was a turnaround of units, and we had major challenges of northeast insurgency. We had the Punjab insurgency taking off, we had the J&K insurgency taking off. Now the units which had been fighting in Sri Lanka got out and they were pushed into these areas. Now, having successfully fought against the LTTE, these guys were now highly trained combatants. They were no more the conventional army soldiers. They knew how to fight a terrorist like a terrorist. Now this is the famous quote of the counterinsurgency and jungle warfare school at Virangte in Mizoram, which says, and it teaches you that fight a terrorist like a terrorist. So that's the only way to fight him. You can't be fighting him with mollycoddling him. Whatever you're doing is winning the hearts and minds of people or doing civic action is a totally different aspect. So This sort of got the Indian Army so well prepared that I feel sorry for the guys who fought us, from whether it was the Pakistani aided Khalistani guy from Punjab, or in J&K, or the Ulfa guy. He didn't know what hit him. Because now here we had highly trained, highly skilled guys who could smell a rat out in 30 seconds and know where to get him. And now the same guys, as years went by, in 99 got deployed in Vijay. We fought the Pakistani intruders on great heights. And the same legacy has moved forward to 2020 when Galwan happened. So it was no more that somebody can come and bullshit you and get away.
Right.
He's going to get it back, with or without weapons.
Correct.
So that has been demonstrated adequately, and I think that is the hallmark of our Indian Army, to continuously be victorious each and every time. This is only one tournament where there are no seconds, there's no silver medal. You got to get the gold, damn it.
Right.
Otherwise, the game's up. And fortunately, Indian Army has delivered well each time, and I hope and pray that the guys who are in service today, they should be protected from harm's way, and I'm sure they'll always deliver when they have to, with the ultimate sacrifice. But why wait for the ultimate?
Right.
Why not ensure that things don't go southwards? There are many ways to resolve an issue. The army is always, or the defense services are always, the sword arm of the government. The army is the cutting edge of the sword, so it has to remain sharp.
Right.
So when it cuts, it must cut deep to the bone and cut the enemy to destroy it. So that, in a nutshell, is the sub-cheese of the entire Op 1 story that I have to narrate today. And I think there'll be much more. We can talk about the mechanized operations a little later. We can talk about the naval aspects of the operations. We can talk about the air aspects. We can talk about the logistics nightmare. Imagine that you had more than 1 lakh troops on the island, and they had to be given everything, right from your normal salt to the assault weapon that he was firing. So it was a nightmare for the logisticians. It was a nightmare because the local contractors in Tamil Nadu had refused to support.
Okay.
So your supply chain was further extended into the hinterland. So there were many challenges to this operation. It was not simple. And that's the reason, some of us as veterans feel that Op 1 has a lot of relevance for lessons to be learnt, to be taught to the newer generation. LTTE was a very harsh and a strong terrorist organization trained by us. And I'm proud to say they learnt well. And I'm also equally proud to say that having taught them, we still beat them at it. So, guru रहता है, मतलब चेला जितना मर्जी कर ले वो गुरु तो नहीं बन सकता है.
But not the best.
Yeah. So, because you have to be constantly, you have to be innovative, you have to be pragmatic. And as the new mantra is these days, you have to learn, unlearn, relearn, and this is a continuous cycle that continues. And now, of course, with AI coming in, machine learning, Internet of Things, the game becomes more complex because it is being used effectively by both sides.
Correct.
So you have to be up, you have to be nimble on your feet, you have to be agile to learn, and be ready to outsmart your adversary, whether it be a non-state actor or a state actor or a conventional military operation.
Being a step ahead of it.
Obviously, you have to be. Otherwise, you lose. I told you there are no seconds. I mean,
It's now or never.
Yeah, and that's the way it is. There's nothing in between.
So also that you mentioned about the localites in the south not supporting in the logistics. So was it because of their disliking towards the armed forces, or probably their support to the LTTE that usually the cases came up as such?
You see, the Tamils of Tamil Nadu and South India have an affiliation with the Tamils of Sri Lanka, because firstly,
Right.
same caste, color, creed, country cousins, and they felt that the Indian army has to go and fight and protect their cause, but not realizing that the LTTE was fighting against all the norms that had been agreed to. And therefore, there were many occasions during the tenure of the IPKF that Prabhakaran and his leadership could have been eliminated, but whenever such an opportunity came, it was always negated by the political leadership not to do it. To that, in hindsight, probably the thought process was that he was a known entity, and therefore it was easier to deal with him than to get somebody fresh into the chair and not knowing what is he going to do next. So in many cases, like even in our western border or elsewhere, you'll find that the government is happy talking to somebody whom they understand.
Familiar.
Not familiar, but whom they understand as to what is he thinking.
Okay.
Because you have to understand that, you see, if you take an action, what is going to be his reaction, and so you have to be a step ahead. So,
Right.
so it's better to understand that guy and engage with him, rather to get somebody who's absolutely new and you don't even know what his genetics is all about and how they're going to act and react. So you have a new monkey to skin. So that's the way to look at it.
So that you have summed up most of the points about Pawan, and this makes me ask you that as a tanker, what was your experience with the T-72 tanks during the operations in Sri Lanka and the cities, and how do you relate the operations of a tank in the city to that with the current context, the Russian-Ukraine conflict going on right now?
I think that's a very important question you asked, because the Indian Army last operated in Sri Lanka when it was fighting in the built-up area, and today we have the Russian Army deployed, in Ukraine and fighting in built-up areas, and we see a lot of videos on social media.
Right.
So let's do some things correctly. Firstly, let's get the perspective right. When Indian Army deployed tanks in Sri Lanka, they were more to give added firepower to the infantry battalions, which had been overwhelmed by the LTTE's devastating tactics and firepower. Remember, the infantry battalions had self-loading rifles with ammunition of 7.62 mm 51, which was devastating on a single shot kill. More required for conventional operations, vis-a-vis what the LTT was carrying, the AK-47 or the G3 rifles, which had immense firepower in terms of rounds per minute firing capability. Let me narrate an incident. We had Major Shunan Singh from 10 Para Commandos, who was also, heavily engaged in operations. He was asked by GOC IPKF, what is it that the SLR can't do and what the AK-47 can? So I'm told, this is a hearsay, so you'll have to go by what I'm saying as a hearsay. He told the GOC, he says, sir, give me an AK-47, I'll go belt into the jungles, and you send 10 of your best men after me, I'll send you back 10 dead bodies.
Okay.
Now, he was stating that because an AK-47 has a 30 round magazine, very rapid rate of fire. You can fire single shot, you can fire a burst of 3, you can fire on full automatic. The SLR was a single shot. You had a 20 round magazine, but it had immense firepower to knock out a man and kill him instantly. No mere no matter where you hit the guy. Now, the same infantry, when engaging with the LTTE, and these guys were nimble-footed. They would operate in 5-6. They would climb up coconut trees. They would climb up rooftops. They would fire at you from one position, fire a burst from one tree, shift to the other, and therefore you could never get a sense of what was the opposition against you, and especially at night. You can't see where the fire is coming from, but men are dropping around you, and not a very good scene to be in. So the tanks had devastating firepower, a 125 mm smoothbore gun, HE shell of about 33 kgs. When you fire it at close range, it knocks off the opposition straight away. Whether the guy is on a tree or on a house, in a given area, in one round you have blasted away the opposition. So the tanks were basically being used as fixed platforms behind which the infantry would move, and they would knock off this opposition, thus reducing the casualties being inflicted. Was that the correct way of using tanks? No, it wasn't, because tanks are not supposed to be used as pillboxes. They are used in conventional sub-unit levels of a troop, which is minimum of 3 tanks. There's a troop leader, and he is able to utilize those 3 tanks correctly in a mechanized warfare or an armored warfare. The second thing that has to be borne in mind is that the Jaffna Peninsula was something which had sea on the one side, it had multiple lagoons inside. So the water table was very high. The tanks could not move cross country. There were paddy fields, or lagoons, where the tanks, being heavy equipment, 45 tons, could easily get bogged down. So they had to move perforce on existing roads and tracks or railway lines. So the enemy knew from where you could operate.
Right.
But notwithstanding that, after the few setbacks that we all had, the combined firepower made sure that the enemy was kept at bay. Now, the same LTT had been trained by the Armoured Corps also as to how to negate a tank. And so, those were being effectively used against us. They would shoot at our vision devices, because when you're closed down in a tank, you're observing everything outside through your vision devices, day devices or night devices. So, they would shoot at that. They would make sure that glass got splintered, you couldn't have a look, so you had to pop it off your cupola, and therefore you presented a target. But we found ways and means to negate that threat. Now, typically, the T-72 is an offensive conventional tank. It is not a tank designed and built to fight in built-up areas. Notwithstanding that, now let's correlate to your question in Ukraine. It's the same tank. Now the threats have changed. This tank was designed sometime in the mid-70s or early 70s and was to be used en masse against the NATO forces in the plains of Europe. And the Russian doctrine was that use tanks in plenty and use their mobility and firepower to overwhelm the enemy in larger numbers. The NATO thought process was that since they couldn't match the Russians in terms of equipment, they said we will have protection, firepower, mobility. Right. So this is just to explain the basics of as to how a tank is designed.
Right.
Now step forward to Ukraine, environment has changed, drones have come in, Azerbaijan conflict reflected as to how the Turkish UAVs were effectively used to do a top attack and negate a tank. Now typically a tank has maximum protection against its frontal arc. In the front chassis, it has protection on the side. minimum protection at the top and minimum at its bottom, because most conventional anti-tank weapons are fired head-on or from the sides, not from the top attack or something else. The Russian army quickly adapted. They made those cages, they put nets, and they ensured that the top attack would succeed. But that was just being, to use loosely the term, doing a jugaad.
Right.
Today, an active protection system for the tanks is a requirement. Like all modern aircrafts and ships have anti-protection systems on board. So a tank too needs one. There is development towards that. I think the T-90s do have a active protection system which the Russian army uses, but too many T-90s have not been used. And at the same time, there have been cases where T-90s have been shown of being, blown up from the top attack and against the Javelin missiles which the US has supplied and the missiles supplied by the various other NATO countries. The thing has to be corrected is that we really don't know whether the T-90, T-72s or the T-80s that are being shown in the various video clips which are being circulated on social media, which is controlled by the Western governments, are they Ukrainian or are they Russian? So somebody said, the Russians are going to be running out of ammunition, they're going to be running out of equipment. It's a war of 4 days, it's a war of 10 days. So 24th February 2022, and today we are sitting on 29th July. The war is going on. And I'm told the Russians have increased the number of rounds they're firing per day from 20,000 to 40,000. So they're not running out of ammunition, they're not running out of anything. They are fighting the battle that they want to. So, but it is not fitting into the template of the various think tanks in the US or in Europe or in India. Mr. Putin is Mr. Putin. He doesn't listen to somebody and he's doing what he wants to do. He wants to get Ukraine and he'll get it, is my view. I mean, how he gets it may take him a year or two. Well, if the West went back on its commitment, which it gave in, say, on the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, he is doing it now to you. Just stepping away for a moment, the ruble trade is being isolated from the dollar currency. The Chinese currency is also being isolated. We are trying to get our rupee to be isolated from the impact of the dollar. Right. So these are new things from a unipolar world, a multipolar world. Who will win, who will lose, which are the new collaborations that come up, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on one side. It's the Indians, balanced on the center but not bending back towards Russia or to Japan or the others. But on the Quad side, we are still trying to figure out as to how we can sort of keep our balance intact. So I think we are fairly well balanced, and at the same time, I think the tanks would need to get active protection suits. Tank is a weapon of offense. Tank has done its job in Ukraine. It led the Russian army into the hinterland of Ukraine to the objectives that the Russian army wanted to get to. Thereafter, please understand, there is infantry, there are air defense units, there are artillery, there are so many others. What was their role and where are they? I mean, nobody is talking about them. So why singularly look at the tank? The tank did its job. It was what it was meant for. So, but are tanks supposed to fight battles independently? No. You are supposed to be fighting as a combat group or a combined arms group, or the new term the Indian Army uses, integrated battle groups. So there's a complement which is ensuring that your close protection is over there all around. It's like a naval carrier battle group. So you have an aircraft carrier, you have destroyers, you've got subsurface submarines, you've got people flying on top, your people got sensors and all around to make sure that nobody surprises that battle group, but you have the offensive capability to hit out. So you have to do that with your land forces also. So it's an evolving world, and drones will be there, swarm drones will be around, but there will be anti-drone systems and anti-swarm drone systems around. So as we spoke earlier, you have to be nimble-footed, you have to be fast, you have to ensure that your tech is up and about, and using all your resources, integrate what everybody talks about, IoT, machine learning, and all the gizmo fancy words that you hear. So
even the laser weapons.
Direct energy weapons are still under development, and they'll take some time. It's not easy to firstly store energy and release it in a point form. They're still not approved by the UN, and therefore still not on the list to be used as conventional warfare. Though in the space environment, the Chinese have been using it to demonstrate their anti-satellite kill capabilities. But now, since the US has also said that anything that happens in the space is now going to be taken as a conventional operation threat, so things are evolving. So it will be too early to sort of put a grid around what is logical or which is legal and what is illegal. So it's like the LOC. It's all a matter of perception. It's a line, it's imaginary.